Now that we are more familiar with what a doc type declaration is all about and how to use comment tags, I just want to go to Google search, google.com, and I just want to go and discuss here certain topic that I would also want you to know, because again, learning programming language is about you knowing, understanding, remembering, and then applying what you have learned. If you remember, this is my personal acronym that I share to my students, the KURA acronym. Know that it exists. You have to know that this topic that we are discussing right now exists. Now, we have to understand it. So one of the things that I will tell you, if you're having a difficult time understanding some certain topics, again, go back to the idea of reading it once again, reading it one more time, until that point from where you can already explain it in your own words. Okay? Understand it and then remember it. Okay, this exists. So how will I now be applying this in a project? So let's go here, HTML modes. So researching is very important, guys, as I've always said. So right now we have some HTML mode definition here. So this will be quite useful, especially if you're being interviewed and suddenly an interviewer asks you what are quirks mode, what are standards mode. Okay, so technically, guys, this is one of the resources from where you can actually go and read a lot of documentations. So if we try to look at the definition of what is a quirks mode and standards mode here, there's actually three modes that you might encounter. So before, we have what we call the Netscape Navigator and Microsoft Internet Explorer, which are the two versions of browsers that were used commonly. And when the programmers way back before tried to develop web standards, and W3C, technically, W3C is the organization that handles web standards. So it says here browsers could not just start using them because it would break most existing sites on the web. So the browsers, what are the browsers again? These are Chrome, Firefox, we have Internet Explorer. So they introduced this idea of having two modes so that they can treat new standards compliant sites differently from old legacy sites. So there are actually three modes. We have here the modes used for layout engines in web browsers are quirks mode, almost standards mode, and full standards mode. If we go through this documentation, it will tell you that quirks mode layout emulates non-standard behavior in Navigator 4 and Internet Explorer 5, which is very essential in order to support websites that were built before the widespread adaptation of web standards. So the idea here, you have to consider what mode you will need to activate, especially if you're going to be building certain types of websites. If it will not be websites that will be following the standards that are being implemented right now, such as HTML5, or will you be building a website that will be running in older browsers? But again, this is a good information that you should know, just in case that some future employers will be asking you what's the difference between the different mode that we have here. It's good that you know it. As to one of my favorite quotes in the Seventh Heaven series, it never hurts to know a lot of things. So it's good that you know this. At least you will have something to run inside of your head once someone asks you a question about it. At least you will have an idea. Oh, I encountered that during my HTML fundamental course, the HTML modes. Okay, so in full standards mode, we have what we call here, the behavior is hopefully the behavior described by the HTML and CSS specifications. And in the third mode here that we have the almost standards mode, wherein only a very small number of quirks are implemented. So how do browsers determine which mode to use? Again, this is one of the uses of the doc type declaration. So if we try to read the documentation here, for HTML documents, Browsers will be using the doc type in the beginning of the document to decide whether to handle it in quirks mode or standards mode. So that we can ensure that your page uses full standards mode, make sure that your page has a doc type like in this example. So this is the similar thing that we have in our document template, even in the, if you remember, JSBean website, we also had this as an initial template. So if we go down here and further read more of the documentation here, the doc type shown in the example, the doc type HTML, is the most simple doc type declaration, and it is the one that is recommended by HTML5. So if you're going to be using earlier versions of the HTML standard for the other variants or versions of HTML5, almost all existing browsers today will be using full standards mode for this doc type. So even the dated Internet Explorer 6. So there are no valid reasons for you to use a more complicated doc type. If you do use another doc type, you may risk choosing one which triggers almost standards mode or quirks mode. So again, if you use the HTML 4.01 doc type declaration, that might trigger the almost standards mode or the quirks mode here. So make sure that you put the doc type right at the beginning of your HTML document, as to what we have here. Anything before the doc type, like a comment or an XML declaration, will be triggering quirks mode in Internet Explorer 9 and older. In HTML5, the only purpose of doc type is to activate full standards mode. Older versions of the HTML standard gave additional meaning to the doc type, but no browser has ever used the doc type for anything other than switching between quirks mode and standards mode. So if we go here and we have Firefox here, and if we right click and view page info, you would see here that the render mode under the information here states that we have standards compliance mode. So at least, again, you are aware of this. You know that there are different HTML modes, and the doc type declaration is usually used to activate the standards compliance mode here, especially for the browsers that are currently in the market right now. But for the older browsers, once you try to use the older declarations, you might have the tendency to activate quirks mode and almost standards mode. One keynote to remember here is that the doc type declaration that we have in our document can be used to switch from, let me just remove this and save it and then refresh our document here. And you would see that once we open our view page info, the render mode is now quirks mode. So it's really important that you declare your doc type declaration, so at least it will be identifying the version of HTML that your document is using.